Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahe Tejasvinavaditam Astu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us both. May we work together with great vigor and energy. May our study be illumined. May we not unnecessarily cavil with each other. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Benachtai ara Goliath. So blessings to you all on this few days which we celebrate from the 16th here onwards for the whole weekend, and that is St. Patrick's Day, otherwise known as Paddy's Day as well. So I thought we'd just say a few things about St. Patrick. The first thing is that not much is known about St. Patrick except for two works that he himself created. One was a biographical work, which was called Confessio, Confessions. And there he gives not only an autobiography, but also an outline of his great mission in Ireland. The other one is a letter to a soldier or soldiers that indicate some of his biography, some of his struggles. And these struggles are spiritual struggles. And there are also justifications as well for some of the things he had been very heavily criticized for. Now, when we talk about these great, great figures, we have to relate what use is it to us, because we know in history about Attila the Hun, Alexander the Great, all these historical figures. But St. Patrick is remembered not just as a patron saint of Ireland, but he's also ranked by the Eastern Orthodox Church in Christianity as equal to the apostles. A remarkable status he's given. And if you go to Armagh, he seems to have been the first bishop of Armagh. Armagh is the seat of the whole of Ireland for the Roman Catholic Church. And so great, great significance, not only as St. Patrick's Day, great celebration, but it's also a holy day of abstinence, because it's during the month of Lent. 17th of March is supposed to be the date of his death, but it also happens to be a universal celebration of springtime. You must have noticed how daffodils in the country have suddenly bloomed, and how there's a new brightness to days. The sun is rising earlier, it's going to bed later, and we can see the evidence, the preamble, as it were, the announcement of summer creeping up on us. It's a wonderful and beautiful time where we see new blooms are there. And I think it's appropriate, therefore, that we have a big, big indulgent celebration, as well as understanding the significance of this great figure. It is great, great saints, that is, people dedicated to the fundamental purpose in life, namely spirituality, that have the enduring legacy. And so this is how we celebrate St. Patrick's Day, because of the great figure of the person who started off as a slave, abducted from the British Isles by pirates. Today, we also have slavery. But individually, of course, our spiritual slavery has to be noticed. It's not that we are slaves, but we are under the impression that we are not free. There are some theologies which will say, let us start off from a point of view that we are disadvantaged, we have some kind of gap. We start off from an inferior and hopeless situation and expect the subject of our adoration to raise us up. This has a certain value, because you see, when we start our spiritual practice, meditation and so on, we should really, in terms of devotional meditation anyway, start off from a feeling that we are dependent, that we are completely helpless, but not that we are hopeless. There's a great difference. In other words, we are prepared to surrender our whole life and our whole being on the basis that nothing really belongs to us. Everything really is the result of divine grace flowing to us, through us, beyond us, until the realization is that that divine operates as us and beyond us. What a sweet method is the path of devotion. Most people are devotees. So to start off, like a child is helpless, very different from a position of hopelessness. And to place this unnatural rescuing hope, this salvific value on the divine, I think is a starting point. It's a reasonable starting point. But there was something called pelagianism, I should say, was a doctrine that said, no, and it was a heretical doctrine, sorry, that postulated, no, we are not dependent on the sin of ancestors, the genetic flaws of Adam and Eve. We are only dependent on our own actions. This is a position that in Vedanta we strongly take. And I think great saints also not only realize this, but labor on it. St. Patrick was a slave. He wasn't particularly religious. He was abducted at the age of 16. We can imagine the hopeless condition he felt that he was in. Looking after sheep, serving 4 families of Druids, so his hagiography tells us. And in a lonely place, rough place, not so beautiful cultivators as we have it now, but full of bogs, full of forests, not a very hospitable place, and this huge barrier of the sea to get back home to his parents, who must have been out of their minds with worry, suddenly snatched by raiding people and treated very badly. So, what is the spiritual significance of this? We all appear to be in bondage. We all appear to be in a hopeless condition and a helpless condition, but this is the very basis for his visions. Suddenly, in this desperation, as with all of us, we have to bear in mind that the whole subject of yoga is taught to us in the Bhagavad-Gita. It's a journey from helplessness, hopelessness, a journey from desolation, a journey from depression to immense elation through a path of knowledge, through a path of active participation in spiritual life, to a realization at the end. All 18 chapters are a pilgrim journey from the bottom to the top. And so when people are depressed, I say, congratulations, you have started your spiritual journey. Let us continue and go from deeper and deeper realms where we find the only answer to our difficulties and problems are in moments and flashes of inspiration that touch our hearts deeply, and where we now, with an elevated mind, are able to express some joy. So while we start from a position of holy day meaning a day of discipline, a day of tapasya, a day of strengthening the will, a day of denial to the senses, we can join it also with a feeling of celebration, because the joy of inner spiritual life immensely outweighs, when we get used to it, immensely outweighs any joy we get externally from the senses. We can say that St. Patrick took himself out of slavery. inspired by a vision, we see that he himself was responsible for finding a way out, and miraculously, through many adventures, found his way back to his parents. But the inner inspiration that obviously his father was very religious. His father was said to be a deacon, a part of the Roman legacy in Britain. But then he studied as a cleric. He became ordained as a priest. We don't know when he was elevated to a bishop. But this great inspiration to go back to his land of slavery is remarkable. To go back to his very, very point where he must have gone through all the emotions of missing his homeland and his family, missing the luxuries that he had because, by all accounts, he was brought up in a reasonably well-off family. He didn't lack anything. Kind of part of a Roman culture and legacy in Britain. But here he became deeply reflective, inspired by inner visions, calling him across the seas, come on. And the openness to respond to a call is the openness that we all have to cultivate. There was, in his day, somebody called Palladius, who was an earlier Christian. It's not that St. Patrick founded Christianity at all in Ireland, but he is attributed with doing it. That must be also a tribute to the giant status of his personality. How he was able to interact with the current Celtic traditions without upsetting it. Ireland is the very, very unique country that was never converted by force. And it would have taken several hundred years, not just in terms of St. Patrick, but other pioneers in Christianity. We hear, for example, St. Kieran of Segar lived in the late 4th century, or about 352 to 402. Patrick was probably the latter half of the 5th century. And St. Kieran was the first bishop of Ossory. We find other saints mentioned, Auxilius, Secundinus, Acerninus. They're also associated with early churches in Munster, Leinster. And Palladius was active in Ireland, probably from 460s onwards, giving maybe rise to a thought on the part of some scholars that maybe Palladius was St. Patrick. We don't know for sure, but both of them are mentioned. But St. Patrick is the one that emerges as being the founder, the main patron of Ireland. All the great traditions associate missionary movements with the Hill of Tara, which is associated with the High King of Ireland, Killashie, County Kildare. All of these have links to the kings of Leinster, and probably named Auxilius after some places there. This activity was limited, it seemed to be limited to the southern part of Ireland. But Patrick's influence seemed to be more in the north of Ireland. It is in Downpatrick, or at least that is associated with the activity of St. Patrick. And his burial place seems to be around about there as well. According to the Confessions of St. Patrick, he was abducted, as we had said, by Irish pirates. And they took him there to Ireland, enslaved. But 6 years later, Patrick writes in his Confessions that the time he spent in captivity was critical to his spiritual development. And he explains that the Lord had mercy on his youth and his ignorance. You know, we're all mere children, and we all suffer under the great, great shadow of ignorance. This is our only difficulty. But this afforded him the opportunity to be forgiven for any of his misdeeds or any of his ignorant weaknesses. And he converted internally to Christianity. He did this while he was in captivity. He worked as a shepherd. He strengthened his relationship with God through prayer, eventually leading him to this conversion. Spiritual life begins with earnest prayer. It begins with connecting to our deeper reality by connecting with our dearest concept, dearest ideal that is revealed to us. And the more this is revealed to us, the more sorrowful we are. Naturally, the fruit of prayer is tears. Krishna describes two types of tears. One flowing from the inside. This is to do with really our own personal, individual sorrow. The other is streaming from the external part of the eyes. This is to do with indescribable feelings of devotion, feelings of love, feelings of compassion, inner joy. How difficult it is to get a vision of God. Well, Sri Ramakrishna says, here's the thing. If you weep these kinds of tears for 3 solid days, you will surely get a vision of God. But then he says, giving us the limitations of our humanity. Yes, but you see, who would weep for God? Men weep for wife and children, family, loss of wealth, etc. But whoever weeps for God, we weep buckets full of tears is the expression, but whoever does it for God. So while the process is very simple, the conviction to do it, the resolve to do it, the sincerity to do it is missing in us. And so prayer is the answer. What is prayer? Well, when we say prayer at this level, excuse me, we're not talking of petition, not of a material kind. We're talking of a connection in the heart, a conversation with God, a deep listening, a listening of a kind where we hear the internal voice of God and we respond lovingly. And this prayer leads us to a revealing aspect in spiritual life, which is meditation. Prayer is called also, japa is also a kind of prayer. The repetition of a holy sound that embodies our chosen ideal. And so we can see how with all these mechanisms, the fruits of this would be an internal revelation. This internal revelation is called a vision, a sight that inspires us not to a selfish enjoyment of spiritual fruits, but really to a helpfulness, to an expansion of the heart that then allows us to be of service to mankind. He describes his vision in this way. He says, I saw a man coming, as it were, from Ireland. His name was Victoricus, and he carried many letters. And he gave me one of them, and I read the heading, The Voice of the Irish. And as I began the letter, I imagined in that moment that I heard the voice of those very people who were near the wood of Falkland, which is beside the Western Sea. And they cried out as with one voice, We appeal to you, holy servant boy, to come and walk among us. A beautiful message. We appeal to you. In other words, we are desperate. Our own tears are flowing. We feel we need rescuing. Holy servant boy, you used to be a slave. You used to be a slave of pirates who sold you into slavery. But now you have a new master. You are a servant of the highest Lord. You are a servant of Christ. We appeal to you for what? To come where you used to be and walk among us in freedom now. Walk among us and describe to us the mysteries and see if you can align our Celtic traditions with this message of Christ without violence, but with a kind of synchronization, a syncretic vision where we take all the old traditions, just as other Christian missionaries had done so. What a terrible mystery theologians are faced with in Christianity. They have the concept that this one entity, this monotheistic entity, somehow splits itself into three persons. This has always been a difficulty in the theology, and monotheistic religions such as Islam would heavily criticize Christianity for being polytheistic. Great anathema in Islam. How do you explain this? Now, many explain it through modalism, but modalism is a heresy, according to Christianity. Modalism says, you see, one entity can take a number of different roles and forms. If you ask somebody, are you a son or a daughter? They'll say, yes, I'm a son or a daughter of somebody. Are you a brother? Yes, I have sisters and other brothers. Are you a father? Yes, I have a son. Are you a cousin? Are you a nephew? Are you an employee? You see, you can take all these roles on. You don't have to be 7 or 8 different people. You can take different modes. But this modalism is put aside, and it is said, this Trinity is really a mystery. Beyond that, we can't go. You accept it. Just out of faith, you accept it. But here's St. Patrick taking the native plant, which is there, taking the shamrock with 3 tiny leaves. If you see the shamrock, it's not the huge thing that is put on advertising St. Patrick's Day. They're tiny, tiny plants, very delicate, beautiful. When the Taoiseach goes to America, it's traditional that he gives a shamrock plant to the president. And there are these 3 leaves, but 1 stem. The explanation of this monotheistic God with 3 aspects says, you see, it's like this plant. 1 stem is there, but you'll see 3 leaves coming up. A most beautiful, yet simple explanation that was able to, in a moment, explain the mysteries that great theologians find great difficulty stumbling over their words to explain. This was the beauty of St. Patrick. This is what made him great. His holy life made him great. The holiness where he was able to get these visions that inspired him to change the whole direction of his life. Some people suggest that Victoricus of St. Patrick's vision might be identified with St. Vitricius, a very holy bishop of Rouen, because this is where St. Patrick did his study. Patrick also comes from the Latin indicating father. And this Bishop of Rouen was there in the late 4th century. He had visited Britain in an official capacity in the year 396. Of course, this leads us to just fill in the blanks that Patrick had studied in Europe, principally at a place called Auxerre, but is thought to have visited at Marmoutier Abbey in Tours, and to have received the tonsure at Lerins Abbey. Saint Germanus of Auxerre, bishop of the Western Church, ordained him to the priesthood. So there is a kind of history. But acting anyway on his vision, St. Patrick returned to Ireland as a Christian missionary, as we know. And his landing place, according to many, was in fact Wicklow in Southern Ireland, at the mouth of the river Inverdy, which is now called Vartree. And there's a suggestion that Wicklow was also the port through which Patrick had made his escape, which is remarkable because St. Patrick was known to have been in Sligo or thereabouts in Northern Ireland. So quite a trek down to escape his slavery. 6 years he was in captivity, 6 remarkable years of slavery. And we recall how in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's great significance based on slavery in Egypt, and the great exodus may be symbolic of going to a land of milk and honey, a better paradise. Much of the confessions, or what is also called declaration, concerns changes or charges, changes in his interior life, but also some charges against Patrick by his fellow Christians at a trial. Now, what these charges were, he doesn't say explicitly, but the lesson for us is, don't expect life to be smooth. We also have many challenges. We have many difficulties. We have many people talking against us. And how do we deal with these obstacles is part of our practical spiritual life. We don't crash through them. We don't run away from them either. We find a way skillfully around them, knowing that we have the assistance of divine grace. And divine grace will also provide us with solutions in the most difficult of circumstances. Right now, there are many, many people facing very, very difficult and trying times, resulting in great, great millions and millions of displaced people from ravages of war. In my own life, of course, just as in your own life, we have faced many difficulties and obstacles. We welcome them, those who have a challenging attitude, one imbued with faith that says, actually, we are in the hands of some greater entity, and we find this entity flowing itself through us, through hands and legs, and through thought also, providing us with the necessary inspirations for how to get around obstacles, a kind of point of creativity that we welcome. Not only do we welcome it, but it also inspires us to inspire others also about how to get around problems and difficulties. This is really the message of every single missionary, whatever religion they are. The condemnation of St. Patrick might have contributed also to his decision to return to Ireland. That factor might have been there. Despite Patrick's vigorous insistence that he was innocent of any charges or any kind of malice or malicious gossip against him, Patrick eventually returns to Ireland. We see that he has to face, though, authorities in England because, like every great person, he was a revolutionary. He was a rebel. He was a person who took risks. What other people, though, more knowing people, call he was a person of faith. He was a person of spontaneity. Somebody who had the charisma, naturally, to see that his legacy lasted, that he was able to have an influence in the country he went back to. And something can be seen also in Patrick's mission. He writes that he baptized thousands of people. Our modern Vedantic speak for this. Our Eastern spiritual speak for us is he initiated many people into spiritual life. He ordained priests. He led the new Christian communities. He converted wealthy women some of whom became nuns in the face of their own family opposition. And he also dealt with the sons of kings, converting them too. And we know that the spread and the influence of early Christianity in Ireland was really the deep connection that was there between abbeys and kings. Abbeys were retained close to palaces and forts, places where kings resided, so that they were protected spiritually. And the mutual arrangement was abbeys were protected by the might of the kings as well. So in the Confessio, we find general vagueness about the details of his work in Ireland, though giving some specific instances, partly because he says that at points he was writing for a local audience of Christians who knew him and his work. But there are several mentions of traveling around the island and of sometimes difficult interactions with the ruling elite. He does claim of the Irish, never before, he says, did they know of God, that is the deepest spiritual reality, except to serve idols. We know how sensitive this is in the Abrahamic word, this concept of idols. But we can, of course, give it a different understanding. That is a superstition designed to deliver materialism, perhaps, and unclean things. But now they have become the people of the Lord and are called children of God. The sons and daughters of the leaders of the Irish are seen to be monks and virgins of Christ, in other words, nuns. Patrick's position as a foreigner in Ireland was not an easy one. We have to recall that the patron of Ireland was a foreigner to Ireland. There are many multicultural components now in the rich Irish fabric. And sometimes there's opposition to this, but there's also sympathy that many people from Ireland had to go as refugees to other countries during the famine, for example, and during hard economic times, even in the 1980s. So I think there is a sympathy and indeed an empathy for refugees coming to Ireland. And of course, there is the richness of multicultural integrations. Where our ashram is, if you look across to the schoolyard on a typical school day in the school that is adjacent to us, we find a rich fabric in this particular area of many, many different cultures and many different nationalities, partly due to refugee status, the openness that Ireland has to people other than indigenous Irish people. But still, Patrick, a foreigner, coming to Ireland, getting used to the culture, is a missionary of a roaming type. We are also doing missionary work in our Vedanta society. It's an opportunity for us to reach out to the local community, reach out to the Irish people who are in great, great need of sustenance. Swami Vivekananda, in his lecture, or that comes under the specific collection of treatise on karma yoga, in his secret of work, he describes a kind of ranking order to give people their utmost freedom is surely the highest good that we can do humanity, the highest charitable work we can do for our fellow human is to indicate, here is the way out of slavery, here is the way toward freedom. And this is what St. Patrick also was doing. Here is a way out of your own slavery. I was a slave for 6 years, but here you have a slavery of a different kind, a slavery to ignorance. Here's a way out. And so this is our missionary work for all of us, to go out, not to sit and wait for people to come to us. That won't work. So his refusal to accept gifts as a foreigner from kings placed him outside the normal ties of kingship, fosterage, and affinity. He wanted to assert his independence. Legally, he didn't have any protection, and he says that he was on one occasion beaten, robbed of all he had, and put in chains during his ministry, perhaps awaiting execution. Patrick says that he was also, many years later, a captive for 60 days. He doesn't go into any details about it. In one life of St. Patrick, there's a supposed prophecy by the Druids, which give an impression of how Patrick and other Christian missionaries were seen by those who were hostile to them. Across the sea would come Adze head, crazed in the head, his cloak with hole for the head, his stick bent in the head. He would chant impieties from a table in the front of his house. All his people would answer, "So be it, so be it." Thus the Celtic prophecy went. The second piece of evidence that comes from St. Patrick's life is a letter to Coroticus, or letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. It's the second piece of literature from St. Patrick's own hand. We find it first remonstrates against ridicule and insult. And in this, Patrick writes an open letter announcing that he has excommunicated Coroticus because he had taken some of Patrick's converts into slavery while raiding in Ireland. It was against the moral and ethical code that St. Patrick was teaching. And the letter describes the followers of Coroticus as fellow citizens of the devils and associates of the Scots and apostate Picts. And this is all based largely, of course, on an 8th century gloss, this commentary. But Coroticus is taken to be King Ceretic of Altclu. Some have proposed that it is based on evidence more likely that Coroticus was a British Roman living in Ireland, perhaps. And it is suggested that it was the sending of the letter which provoked the trial that Patrick had to attend, and he mentions it in his confessions. Standing by the moral precepts marks out a great person. Taking bold decisions marks out even decisions that may be a little unconventional. We see again one more insight into Patrick's giant personality. Anyway, many legends have grown around this figure of St. Patrick. He is always depicted with shamrock in detail, such as stained glass portraits, many different varieties, all with a beard, I'm happy to say, but the staff of the bishop, a shepherd, indicating he was a shepherd of the flock. And always in green, the color of fertility, the color of Ireland, the Emerald Isle. Legend credits Patrick with teaching the Irish about the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, as we've described. And in pagan Ireland, as it was then, as it was described, there was a significant number of people who were in the Celtic tradition, and the Irish had many triple deities in their polytheistic tradition. And so this was a fact that may have aided Patrick on his evangelization efforts, taking something that was familiar to them and explaining it to them in their terms, so that it wasn't difficult for them to see the relevance, the deeper significance of what they already had, not destroying what they had, but supplementing it, providing a deeper richness to it. This is a very great secret of the missionary endeavor. That is a syncretic approach that adopts and adapts what is already there. In Vedanta, we have to learn to adopt the local traditions and culture, and to adapt it so that it's more accessible for them to get the higher teaching about freedom. The ranking order in the secret of work that Swami Vivekananda gives is that we have to give people the opportunity to access their long life freedom. Of course, doing good works, relieving pain, is a very, very high order of business. But when you give somebody a freedom, you're also giving them a formula to deal with and get around pain. Nashojati, getting over grief, is one of the keynote messages in the whole of the Upanishads. How can we bypass pain? Adopted, of course, by Buddhism more directly. Life is painful. The pain is caused by our desires. That is, by our valuation of the world in front. But there we won't find the end of pain. We'll find moments of happiness. And how do we deal with it? We go on a discovery journey. In Buddhism, it's called Eightfold Path. That's all. And we can get around this. So there's a practicality to our teaching. It makes our work extremely charitable. Notwithstanding that, of course, we're looking after the material needs of others also. And we are comforting those who are grieving, yes, and we are saving a life. But to save a life on a permanent basis, this is our missionary work. This is the work of all missionaries. And so we have to praise St. Patrick for his work, for his life, and for his teachings. So with this small talk on St. Patrick, I would encourage you to enjoy the extended weekend dedicated to him and to his life. And while we're enjoying our celebrations, as we do traditionally, painting Irish flags, identifying this St. Patrick with Ireland itself and everything Ireland stands for, its sense of independence, its sense of contribution to art and culture worldwide, its pride in undergoing great, great hardships and suppressions and coming out glorious. And so this tiny island of Ireland that has contributed so much to the international stage, to the historical stage, in science, in art, and in a kind of welcoming tradition that makes Ireland a great, great home of hospitality, gives it a great welcoming, making tourism one of the great industries of Ireland, which has suffered naturally from the COVID. I see with great, great beauty how it has opened up. And St. Patrick Festival, with all its many events, and the St. Patrick's parade that occurred on St. Patrick's Day itself, brings in tourism, who can catch the spirit, the optimistic spirit of Ireland, having come out of their own version of slavery, their own colonial past, and going into an optimistic spring, which has left them an optimistic people, I think, a people that are welcoming and a people that have a certain sense of humor. Nobody can tell a joke, not even me, especially not me. Nobody can tell a joke with greater humor, greater expression, in the greater poetic expression than the Irish. And so the whole world is celebrating this St. Patrick's Day, no doubt, but particularly here in Ireland. Please enjoy the rest of the weekend with the understanding that these celebrations are deeper than just having fun. There is this deep, deep joy of spirituality that St. Patrick had, that he felt like every other great saint, missionary, and mystic. I thank you. Guru Mahagat.